Welcome to the Level Up Artist Podcast. We are your hosts, Adriana M.A. and
Jackie Sanders. We are two art professionals sharing forward the advice and business lessons we have learned along our creative journeys.
We talk to artists, leaders, and art professionals to demystify the creative process and discover new ways to succeed as a career-minded artist.
If you find value in these conversations, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you'll be notified when we launch a new episode every Tuesday.
On today's episode, we are very excited to welcome Jason Blyskal. Jason is an artist and art professional based in Durham, North Carolina. He balances his full-time job as a retail manager for the North Carolina Museum of Art and also has an art practice at Golden Belt Artist Studios. He creates colorful 2D and 3D artwork using a variety of materials, including wood, paper, and stained glass. So welcome to the podcast, Jason.
So glad to be here. This is definitely a first for me.
Yeah, we're so excited to hear more about your professional work as an art professional and as a creative too. And we've known each other for a little while now. I actually met you when you first came to Art Space, but even before then, I remember back, what was it, 2018 or 2019?
Yeah, I mean, like in the grand arc of my creative endeavors, y'all caught me kind of on the just on the cusp of when I was doing some interesting ephemeral things. I had that. There was like a Christmas market at Art Space, I think.
Yeah, it was the holiday.
That might have been like the holiday market. Yeah, I guess I did that. That was maybe 2018. Yeah, something like. So I think that was around then. What year is it?
What
even?
Is time?
Yeah. But yeah, I guess that was when I was doing these little like mat board paper lapel pins, which were a fun thing.
Yes.
And very taxing on my hands. I've moved to a little bit more forgiving material, surprisingly. So yeah, you met me back then, and you were extremely nice and supportive about my things.
We're super fans of your work, and seeing your work then. I mean, Adriana and I had just met. And so I remember
cool.
We would go through our tour of Art Space, being like fangirls of all the local artists and being cheerleaders of other creatives as we tend to be. And
Very
just I remember your work always stood out in my mind. Obviously, we have the geometric love that we share.
Yeah.
Then years later, meeting you almost for a second time in your role working at the North Carolina Art Museum. And I was like, wait, I feel like this is the same person, and then worlds colliding. But from an art making aspect, you described what you were doing a bit before with your lapel pins, but for the work you make now, how would you describe it to someone who has never met you before or seen your work?
Yeah. So I mean, a lot of the ways I approach my practice are I try and have like a utilitarian or functional angle for a lot of my work. So that's kind of like at the forefront. And I mean, I do a form follows function, function follows form. They're both equally as important to me. But I guess stylistically, I would probably compare my work. I would liken it to very poppy elements. There's some color involved, lots of loud colors involved, and definitely geometric. You kind of hit the nail on the head there, while still kind of walking a fine line between abstract and some suggestive elements. So all that into a tiny little description space. But usually after finding out about like what sort of style I want to approach it, I always try and find like how can I make this a little bit more functional? Like can it be displayed in a window to activate light space, or can it be like a tabletop piece to be like a light? So those are usually the things that are racking my brain when I'm just trying to figure out my next project.
Yeah, I love that. And I resonate with that too. And I think that's part of what, made me beeline towards your booth back then was I also explored my work, like some, like abstract lines, there's organic shapes, there's some, little straight lines here and there, and very colorful. And so is yours too. And
Totally.
I don't remember if you had any night lights yet at that time.
Oh,
no,
I mean,
I don't remember what it was, but it wasn't just the pins. But I do remember you had several types of things. And then you also had, I don't remember, it was like there was
my
something
marquee.
Display. Yeah, did you have like a TV with colors already in it, like an LED light? You had something with colorful lights in it, because it was like, ooh, shiny, what is that? Who is that?
Yeah. I think I remember at that display, I had like my lapel pins, and then I had like my giant excessive marquee, which I had, I just finished making, and it weighed like 1,000,000 pounds, and I had to bring it somewhere to justify its being made.
Yes.
So I just started doing stained glass at that point, probably. And I was working at a stained glass studio at the time too, which was a really good resource, as well as just for materials and learning. So it was, yeah, a couple little odds and ends. I was probably like in a transitional phase where, because like you
Yeah.
said, I've dabbled in wood, paper, and glass. I
And
think
light.
in lights, yeah, which is this kind of third, left field sort of medium. Um, but and I still like the back to like the lapel pin thing. I part of what inspired that is I've always wanted to have like certain pieces of my work that were like accessible. I wanted to have some things that were still on the in the spectrum of fine art, so that if someone who was looking for a really elaborate piece could collect that, but also something that like everyone can participate in. So that
Yeah,
was kind of the inspiration for that.
I like that. Plus, from a marketing standpoint, you need different price points anyways. Which
Exactly.
and for
Yeah.
some folks, that might be their first foray. But we'll talk about more of the selly
Oh,
stuff
sure.
later.
Yeah.
But before we dive down that rabbit hole, I do want to ask you, what do you consider to be the most fulfilling part about being an artist?
Yeah, that is definitely the golden question there. Most fulfilling part is uh well, I feel like it's constantly like a chasing the tail race where I have like a spark of an idea from I mean, I'll go just before as a precedent before everything, I'll say that most of my ideas, if people might see them on the back end and they'll think, oh, it's such an original thing, but I get like all of my inspiration from, people who came before me. So I'm constantly looking at other people's awesome work, and that moment after seeing something where I have like the next step of like, oh, this will be a really cool way to do kind of just that is kind of the first most enjoyable part of my process, just like kind of brainstorming. And then, of course, along the way, since a lot of it's trial and error, I, kind of hit roadblocks that are a little more frustrating. But then once the ball starts rolling again, it's kind of like this awesome sandwich of good, bad, good, like,
Something
so
that's
like
mostly good.
yeah, mostly good. But so yeah, I mean, though it's can be frustrating to work out the kinks of a project idea. I think like the discovery of what could be a cool idea and then finally watch it take form is like really fulfilling, for sure.
Yeah, I love that. And especially a lot of your pieces are an exploration of color and geometric forms. I'm curious either what kind of artists, present day or from history, do you look at? And like, where did you really start with your unique style and technique of what you do? Where did that origin for love of geometry come from?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so across a couple of different mediums, I could say historically, there's a couple artists that I've always admired. Like, I've always really been into the Cubist movement, and just like geometric abstraction and abstract expressionism, and for the most part. But I've liked like one artist that comes to mind, George Brock. Definitely, he was like a Cubist. I feel like if you'd seen his work, you'd probably love him as well.
Yes.
I love George Brock, and as from a sculpting angle, there's a piece at the collection which is my personal favorite at the museum, from artist Alexander Archipenko. I think he was definitely take this with a grain of salt, either Russian or Czechoslovakian. He did very cubist and minimalist representations of the human form that I really like. The piece in the museum's collection is called Blue Dancer. It's in modern and contemporary. It's this piece that's like kind of like that. It's like my favorite piece in the world. So definitely stuff like that. And from an architectural angle, as well as stained glass, I'd say like top of the list is Frank Lloyd Wright.
Of
I
course.
mean, the man was, I know there's plenty of other architects worth mentioning, but because he has that stained glass angle as
Yeah.
well, it's really impressive that he was able to do like houses, and then his stained glass compositions were like top notch. So he's kind
Yeah.
of my dude.
I
Yeah.
feel like anyone that explores the geometric realm, I mean, a Frank Lloyd Wright is kind of a given, especially a lot of my work includes geometry as well. And my dad and mom own an architecture firm. So
Oh, awesome.
vacations were going to Frank Lloyd Wright houses and like seeing
Oof.
fallen waters and how like the nature of the architecture is then brought in with the straight lines. It's unmatched for sure.
Yeah. I was watching a little documentary on his work the other day, and just like kind of scrapping all sorts of like conventional ideas for the sake of just making a piece, like
Yeah.
perfect in his eyes is really commendable. So I mean, those are definitely some like historic artists, but I have many like Instagram heroes who, if they only knew how much I obsessed over them, they'd probably like block me because I'm like, oh, this person is just like killing it right now. There's just some really
Yes.
good stained glass artists out there that I'm really into.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and it's cool too. It's not like you're going Frank Lloyd Wright did this, Tiffany style lamp, I'm going to copy exactly. It's more like, ooh, I like how you did that triangle there. And then there's this other artist. Ooh, I like how they did these double lines over there. And look at this other artist.
Exactly.
And it's in a way like taking all these different influences and almost putting your own taste on it, of course, but it's like your own collage of inspiration from all these
Yeah.
artists. So I like how you do that. Like there's never anything I've seen you do where I'm like, well, that looks exactly like a mantra. You know what I
Thanks.
mean?
Well,
Like
I
make
spend
it
my
look
waking
exactly
hours
like a
like
Mondrian.
yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, and Mondrian is another word you mentioned. I love Mondrian's. I mean, the man mastered, the not just like the grid system, but like,
the original
breaking
Tetris. What?
the original Tetris. Yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, I mean, I'm always looking like, if I see someone's work that resonates with me, I really think hard about like, okay, I don't want to just like steal this idea. Like, I'm really drawn to the thing that they have explored, but like, if there's no original input, then I think that's definitely an important aspect.
Yeah. Or another take on that is like if there is nothing original, couldn't be your own take on it be what is original? I mean, it's like making a
Right.
recipe, right? And you're adding
Yeah.
your own little something since the ingredients already existed, the recipe
Yeah.
maybe already existed, but you're giving it your own take on it, and that's what makes it unique. I don't know. That's just my 2
Yeah.
cents on
Well,
that.
and a lot of times I'll play with the idea is if there's something that I really want to do, like I've thought about kind of doing sort of like making a piece that's kind of a history lesson in and of itself as well, like to do a Mondrian, but then also like talk about Mondrian, like this piece is a Mondrian, and I wanted you to like see that. Or like, I did like a Frank Lloyd Wright stained glass composition, but I would
Yeah,
be like, this is my piece, I'm like, this is
yeah.
a Frank Lloyd Wright piece. I really
This
loved
is
it
a
and I wanted to try
homage
it
to
myself. Yeah, a
yeah.
homage, exactly.
That could be really cool. Or maybe like same style, still calling what it is, but then you change up the colors and give it your own
Exactly.
flavor. I don't know. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
Yeah.
we're bursting with ideas here, which is good. But I do want to ask you, what about when the well feels like it's run dry? Do you have any tips for
Oof.
creatives that just feel like they're creatively blocked and maybe the Pinterest, Instagram scroll just isn't enough right now? Do you have any tips
Boy,
on how to move past that?
gosh, do you guys? Because I mean, yeah, I mean, I do run into that from time to time. And late, it's funny. I'm a little late to the game here. I just discovered Pinterest. Crazy. Like I was an Instagram person for a while, and then
Yeah.
like I've just discovered Pinterest. I'm like, wow, this is incredible. Like they're like planning this algorithm of all the things that I like, and I just can scroll endlessly for all these creations. So I've been collecting a lot of like future projects,
Yeah.
and I mean, I think my number one like catalyst for coming up with like different ideas is kind of I've tried a lot of mediums. I mean, so like glass, it's easy to get stuck in a rut sometimes for me if I like try the same sort of application over and over again. So a lot of what I do is just kind of dancing around and finding like a completely new thing. So like, for a while I was making the night lights, and that comes with its own challenges of like, oh, how many shapes can I fit onto a very small sort of canvas before I exhaust like the amount of things I can do. So I was doing that for a while, and if I started to run out of ideas, I'm like, okay, well, let's do like a larger piece of stained glass. So I have I think what usually the catalyst for me to help inspire me to make different projects is to kind of dance around a little bit, even if it's something I'm not going to make. Like, for an example, I don't do ceramics. I've never done ceramics, but I love ceramic artwork. So I thought, like, I'll see a bunch of people do these amazing sort of mugs, and sometimes I'll pull from completely different mediums to apply to my own. Um, so that's I think once again just kind of letting yourself fall into the void of other people's already current masterworks, and then just like kind of set your own personal objectives aside for a while until they kind of stew for a little bit.
Yeah, and I love that because I love that idea of becoming a beginner again. Because I feel like a lot of time as creatives, especially like you were saying, whether it's with glass or whatever medium you work with, you kind of get in a normal like workflow of like, this is what my creative process looks like. You do this step and then this step and then this step. And so you kind of get
Yeah,
in that repetitive rut. And that's, I feel like, where sometimes creativity isn't always fostered well within that structure. And so you need to almost like force yourself to be a beginner in a new medium or like researching a new style to where you're like, well, I have no expectations to like be good at this because I've never done it before or I know nothing about it. So you can go in like with that fresh lens and that fresh perspective.
yeah,
And then kind of say, okay, I like these two elements of it, like you were saying. and how can I apply that to my current structure?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
And so I'm curious
Um,
right now in the work that you're building. I know you've talked about like multiple studies or iterations or limited editions of smaller pieces that you've done, whether it's works on paper or the lapel pins or the night lights. So what is your creative catalyst right now that you're finding drawn towards or pulling inspiration from? Or are you still in that in between big projects?
Right. Yes. I mean, I was just today. I'm putting the finishing touches on an exhibition at Golden Belt, which we can talk about more. But the theme for that one is like a floral exhibition. So I was kind of like most of the things that I've done in the past have not been like as suggestive as like something floral. So that's been kind of I've been going on the hunt looking for ways to apply that to my style and all the ways I could make kind of floral stained glass. So that's been like the inspiration for this month. But I do have like a handful of ideas on the back burner that I've been working on. Like there's the Artemat, which if you've heard me obsess about before, is
Yeah.
something I'm always thinking about. I do that from time to time and like thinking of, oh boy, like, like that's just always kind of in the back of my mind. How can I turn something into a tiny packageable idea? But the most recent inspiration and motivation has been kind of more traditional style designs of stained glass, which historically has been a lot of, like even church windows, which I would maybe say is probably the first application of like really articulated glass design has contained floral elements as well as religious motifs.
Mhm.
So I'm kind of like trying to go back in time a little bit to bring some like floral elements to like a more contemporary setting. So not just like windows, but like I've been doing. I tried to span the floral thing across sun catchers, like mobiles, as well as some keychains, for something small for people. So that's been a really cool way to change things up.
Like, I like how you're doing that without necessarily saying, I'm going to make this design and then copy it in other formats. You're just going like, I'm creating this concept. How can I adapt it? But it's not a copy either. It's like different iterations of the same theme, which is really interesting, which actually brings me to a question of, about your process. So, what does your actual workflow look like? This is just me not knowing enough about glass, just this much. Played with a lot of mediums. That one has been on the
Yeah.
list, but so help me God, I need to stay away
Well,
from that one
both of
for
you have a
now.
standing
But just,
invitation. If you ever want to just get
yeah.
messy, we can do a lesson any day y'all want.
Oh
Well, hey, I
man.
just dove into ceramics and
Yeah.
I don't know how much money into it, and I don't want to talk about it yet.
Yeah.
And glass is not cheap either. So I'm just like, no, no, stay away. Don't look at other mediums. Don't look at other mediums.
Yeah, right.
Um, but I do want to ask you because from my outsider third party perspective, so to speak, and my understanding of glass, unless you're doing a mosaic, and even then you probably have to do some planning, the way that yours are, where you have like very precise lines and angles, from my, again, outsider perspective, it looks like you would have to plan it in advance. It's not like you sit there and you go, now I'm going to stick a red here, now I'm going to stick a yellow here, and now I need a little piece that fits. There's an empty spot now, we'll deal with it later. Like, it looks like it's pre-planned, or it has to be. So two questions in that. Sorry, here we go.
Yeah.
One of them is it, or like, is there anything intuitive about the process itself? But then also considering that there's probably planning of some sort, are you doing like regular sketches on a notebook or digital, or like how does this thing come into, like, how do you conceptualize it before you actually have to execute on the idea? We already talked about the inspiration. This is more like, pull up your sleeves and we're gonna get to work.
Yeah.
Like, how do
Yeah,
you go?
totally. So I'd say, if I'm starting from scratch exclusively, I would say that I usually sketch, maybe I'll have a reference picture. I usually sketch in my notebook something pretty small so that I can make edits to it really quickly. And from that point on, I start in pencil because the eraser is my best friend. I probably erase 90% more than I actually draw. So I usually sketch in the notebook, and when I'm happy with it, I ink it, and I'll usually take a picture and put it. I use Procreate for just to swap out colors, which is a blessing because sometimes just getting the right colors down is half the battle. So that's usually my I guess drafting process. I'll sketch, then I'll upload it into Procreate and get the colors going. And as far as the glass working, once that drafting process happens, I usually determine what size I want the piece to be. If it is something small, I might be able to keep the original paperwork and just use that as kind of my tracing paper, if you will. But other times, if I'm feeling professional, I'll project it onto a wall and then trace it on the wall. If I'm feeling quick and dirty, I'll just actually put it on my television and trace it directly on my television, so that I now have a larger, representation of the piece I'm trying to work. And then from there, because at that point I'll usually know what colors I'm going to do. Glass work is pretty straightforward in that you would put the pieces you're cutting on the your tracing sheet, if you will. And if you can't see through it, you can color on top of it. And then you use a glass scorer to cut it. And once you have all of your pieces cut, then it's kind of a step-by-step process. Definitely the most, I guess, brainstorming and trial and error is done on the drafting phase, because once you have decided your design, it's a lot of just like kind of methodically cutting it out. And then you wrap each individual piece with copper foil before soldering it together. So the two main methods for stained glass, which is the great divide in the glass world, is copper foil, which comes in a roll that you could individually wrap the edges of all your pieces, or you can snip these lead channels. See if I had any around here, which are basically a pre-made like rigid lead that you then just kind of tuck your pieces into. It's a little bit more costly, I would think, for that stuff, whereas the copper foil is a little more user-friendly. So that's kind of the main swing of things when making, and then just kind of making it look pretty.
That's so cool. And like, we're of course acrylic painters, and there's a lot of painters out there. So if people haven't worked with glass before, you go into your studio and I feel like with many glass artists, you have just like your collection of glass that you have over the years, just like we have our collection of paints. But it's more than just
Right.
color with glass, right? It's also there's like texture variations and densities of the pigment, right? So
Right.
do you gravitate towards any particular style of glass, or are there different styles within it?
Yeah. So I mean, when I was working at this glass studio a few years back, I did acquire, like, they were a glass company that had a lot of textured and clear glass stuff, because they did a lot of commercial and residential like diffusing installations. So there's a lot of waste in the glass world too. Usually the parts that aren't used are tossed away. But I'm a pack rat, so I
Yeah.
hoard all of my materials. And so I had a lot of textured glass, and I like using that for other applications. Like I've made terrariums with some textured glass, or housings that aren't necessarily going to be as ornate as stained glass. So I do like that. And as far as like the colored stained glass side of things, for a while I was afraid to use kind of more traditional church glass, which can sometimes be opaque. And it has like swirly patterns. And I have a piece here which I can use as reference, if I may
Of
do so.
course. Of
So
course.
this is a piece that's not quite yet finished yet, but it's a vase, a stained glass vase. And this has some, like, sort of, I guess they call it, it's like opalescent, like white streaks through it. And I was afraid to use glass like that because it's less transparent than just like translucent glass,
Yeah.
which I started out hanging in windows. So I was afraid that if you were to mix the two of them, like a translucent sort of glass with an
Mm.
opaque one, they might clash, because your eye will be looking at something kind of more flat on the window and also trying to look through it.
Yeah.
So usually my one hang up, and some artists do it differently, is that I usually keep my translucent glass with the translucent glass, and the opaques with the opaques, just so that they're not fighting for like real estate or vibes.
Yeah, that makes so much sense, especially treating like glass as a sculpting element. It's not just observing the piece, but a lot of it, like you were saying, because they're transparent or translucent elements, you're also looking through the piece. So where that point of your vision stops and starts, and light interacting with it makes a lot of sense as like another variable that painters or other visual artists don't necessarily have to think about if you're working on a flat canvas or a flat panel.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, light's tricky, but it's pretty also.
True.
Yeah, there's so much glass that I'll like go shopping for, and I'm like, wow, this is a beautiful piece of glass. I'll probably never use it. Like, like but sometimes you'll find a sheet of glass that in and of itself is just like kind of a masterpiece, and there's so many like movements happening within it that I'm like kind of afraid to touch it, because I might accidentally extract the part of the glass that is like, that takes away from the entire sheet, which a lot of times the
Yeah.
translucent stuff is easier to take out because it's consistent throughout. So
Wow.
Lately, I've been starting to do the opaque glass with more structural work, so that it's kind of the main focus.
Yeah,
That is
that
so
makes a
cool.
lot of sense. And I feel like obviously your creative vocabulary as an artist over the years has really grown to be able to like see and train your eye to see those things. But I'm curious because you also work at the North Carolina Museum of Art. You're the museum
Biggest
store
charge.
manager. Yes. And so I'm curious, as an artist and a creative professional in the industry, how do you balance those two things? How do you balance working at the museum, but then also your art practice? Do you have any tips for artists who may be feeling that pull in two different directions?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting development working in this sector of art, because, well, especially I'm sure when you spoke with Janice recently, she also reiterated. But in the last year and a half, we've definitely tried to push to like catch a lot of artists in the state, which is very representational of all the talent in the area. So um, just from when I'm at work, I try and do a lot of scouting, make sure that there's a lot of mediums and walks of life being represented, which is pretty humbling, because it takes my own artistic side out of the equation. I can do some internal reflecting, of course, but it helps me kind of view things pretty objectively when I see it in a store setting like that. But on the other hand, it also helps me, you know, learn to commodify some of my own things, because a lot of times I do like to just make. And when it comes down to selling work, it's easy to get cold feet and to point out flaws in one's work, and I've struggled with that in the past. So working at the store and working with other artists who are maybe a little bit more solidified in their business side of things has helped me kind of grow in that regard as well.
Yeah, like that idea that while you're making, you're just making, but once it's done, it's a product. And
Yeah,
that
yeah,
you
exactly.
gotta sell it if you want to keep making.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have a handful of my creations at home, and they've been there forever. And sometimes a friend will come over and like, dude, you should sell that. And at this point, I'm like, it's kind of priceless. I don't know. It's worth simultaneously like $0 and whatever you think it's worth. Like, it's just kind of it's gone the distance long enough that I can't put a value on it because it's just like furniture at home. Um, so yeah, it's an interesting sort of push and pull to value one's pieces, and working in a store setting has helped with that. And it's one tricky thing is like, yeah, how much should something cost? We're kind of just talking about that, but also it helps broaden my horizons to see what in passing someone might see a piece and be like, oh, that shouldn't cost that much. But you're not just paying for um, uh, the materials and work you put in. It's the creative output that you're getting as well, and that's a really helpful thing to value, because if someone were to try and argue with me like, oh, this is a little overpriced, like you could really at the end of the day say like, you're paying 100% of the value for, I made this because I thought it was cool, and like, it's yeah, you might not have got it anywhere else. So it's cool to see all the original works that you can come up with under those like restraints perhaps.
Yeah, and I imagine it has to also be helpful for you to articulate, not like in talking about other artists' work and trying in a way to sell other artists' work, right? Which is technically part of the job in a way.
Yeah,
And learning about what their statements say or what the artist is like, especially for those you get to meet. And now you see the artwork in the store all the time. So somebody comes in, you have to be prepared to answer questions. I
yeah,
imagine that has to help you as well with your own art, because now you're getting a little bit more comfortable, not just talking to the public about art in general, like actual original art, but also trying to, you can't really entice them to buy it. Like that's a whole different conversation, but encourage them, educate them, etc. And then you can use some
exactly.
of those same skills when you're selling your own. I imagine it has
Yeah,
to help articulate. Plus, if you go with too much of the artsy, artsy fartsy words, I'm sure you're also going to meet people that are like, I don't even know what that means. And then it's like, no, 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 you got to bring it to a level that's like most everyone can understand. And you don't have to use the word juxtaposition in a sentence.
yeah, right. Yeah,
And
that's
then
a
when you're
really
thinking
good
about
point.
your own work, then that kind of ties in.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. Is because I think whenever a new artist comes in, I try and learn as much about their work as possible. And I've never really considered myself a salesperson, whether it's my own stuff or I could, like I never want to force someone to see the value. Well, I never want to force someone to see the value in something or to force them to buy it. But educating them about like what it is, like point in case about dropping names here. There's someone at the store who sells pens, and they're really, really lovely pens. And they're some people will think, oh, they're on the pricey side, but like the story behind them is really impressive. Like, they're made from wood that was on the museum property. He comes from a long line of pen makers, so he's like extremely well trained. Like and none of that is like, oh my God, you have to buy this pen. It's just like, these are the facts, and like they are impressive and it tells a story. And I think people will have a more educated understanding of what goes into making things, and whether they get it or not, um, really doesn't matter to me. I'm just happy that they cared to hear a story about someone's work because it helps connect people.
Yeah, I like that you keep mentioning story too, because I mean, people think marketing's a dirty word, but a lot of times, especially as it relates to us as art makers, we are storytellers. Like that is how we get our story across about our work and our process and demystifying, what goes behind the scenes kind of things. But besides the folks that you are with already, in the store, which I'm sure that's awesome because, all of y'all are there. You love art in some way, shape, or form to work there, right? I hope.
Yeah.
So you get to talk to each other, and probably support each other. But outside of work, do you have a network of artists that you rely on, and how do you support each other outside of coworkers?
um, Yeah, network of artists. Well, I mean, a good example is well, my partner Annabella is a portrait artist, and she is extremely talented. And we operate on like two completely separate spectrums of the art world. I mean, she spends a lot of time making these like masterpieces of a portrait, and I do stained glass, which is kind of comparing apples to oranges at times. So it's really helpful to have that. Uh, Extra side of like whenever I need help on something, I know I can bring her in and she can critique me, or issue some good points that I might not be able to see myself, and I can do the same for her. So there's a pretty relevant at home art team that we have. But a lot of my friends, or like my immediate friend circle, are in like the music department. So I guess I kind of I have like my extended circle of folks like I've been meeting a lot of really great artists. But as far as people I interact with like fairly regularly, they're in music, so I kind of am like an outlier in my department. So whenever they see something like, oh, dude, sick, and that's kind of like the end of it. So,
But honestly, that's
yeah.
probably refreshing at times too. Because I mean, you obviously have a studio at Golden Belt, which is an art residency space surrounded by a whole bunch of other visual artists. So sometimes it is nice to really like go in between art disciplines, whether it's music or we've been having like some spoken word performances at Art Space, which are really
Oh,
nice
cool.
because it's still like a creative language for sure. You're still communicating a message, expressing yourself, but sometimes it's nice having a different art form to almost provide clarity to your own art form. Sometimes you would
Yeah.
think, oh, well, you're a geometric artist, so you should probably only connect with other geometric artists, where sometimes
Right.
that's not the case. Sometimes you're like, I actually want the opinion of a portrait artist because they think differently than I do, but they still use the same vocabulary, or they still
Right.
understand the idea of communicating a message, whether through music or through visual art or spoken word, where it depends on, I guess, like what kind of collaboration or input you're looking for. Um,
Yeah, and I meant to mention as far as other community, like definitely the other Golden Bell artists here have been good. I've gotten close with a couple of them, and the two other folks that I'm sharing the exhibition room this month. I'd say we all kind of have triangulated our like particular areas of art. Where like one of my gallery mates, Nate Hester, he does a lot of figure drawing and like charcoal outline stuff. So, but we've been kind of going back and forth, like talking about like effectiveness of our pieces. So it's been cool to cohabitate in a space as well, just because we're not just it's not like the exhibition space this month isn't just like stained glass works. It's like my stained glass, his figure drawings, and he has some really cool chandeliers that he's like made from a bunch of like recycled materials. So
that's so
yeah,
cool.
yeah,
That's so awesome. It's nice having art that plays together.
I
yeah,
have a
and also
burning question.
lay it on me.
Okay. Is it fine art or fine
Is it
craft?
fine art? fine art or fine craft, like
I
just
don't
like
want to just call it craft. I don't think it is, but there is a fine line between fine art and fine craft.
like just like applying to like everyone's work, not just specifically my own.
Yours.
Oh
Or
my.
you can't speak for the whole genre, to be fair,
Yeah,
but
I would definitely like to associate myself as a fine craft person, because at the end of the, I mean, I often I definitely am able to see the artistic side of my things, of course, but I like to think of a lot of my things as experiments at the end of the day as well. That the end product of which looks like art, but I'm crafting a lot. You know, I'm not like sitting around with like a little French beret, like just really thinking of all my art moves and like holding myself such a high regard in any way. Like,
oh my god.
I try and humble myself pretty often. I definitely craft. I craft more than I art, for sure. Like the process of crafting is really important, I think, to me. So personally, I can say that I think a lot of my creations are like in the fine craft area, or even just craft, but it's like fine craft, yeah.
I love that. And I feel like it is so interesting hearing how like artists define or explain themselves, explain the work that they do, how they categorize themselves as an artist or a craftsperson or entrepreneur, business owner. But I'm curious, before we wrap up, how would you define success as an artist?
Yeah, that's the big one right there. Honestly, I think defining success, and of course personally, is just enjoying the process. A lot of what I do, as I just mentioned, by crafting, is just kind of pleasantly distracting myself with some fun hobbies that eventually turn into something I can see myself making more of. So my own success is definitely determined by enjoyment of the process, and in just constantly searching for things that I think are cool and can recognize as beautiful in the world. I think those are the two most important things of success. I mean, at the end of the day, it's always great when someone else likes your work and wants to purchase it or have it in their home. But I feel like my success is not determined by that. I think I'll be just making stuff forever. Whether I'll have a house full of stuff that I've made, and if no one bought anything, that's cool too.
You'll have a lot of
what
very
you're really
happy
gonna
friends
buy.
and family members.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I love that. And so obviously you are an experienced creative at this point in many different aspects of the art world. But what is one piece of advice that you wish you had heard before you got started on your creative journey?
Oh yeah. Let's see. Little tidbit of advice. Um, I mean, I'm at the risk of just being redundant here. Is and to quote the guy from Dos Equis, "Stay thirsty." Just constantly look for things that you think are cool. I mean, I meet a lot of people at the store who, even after talking with them about my own stuff, they're like, "Oh, I could never do that sort of thing," or that's just I'm not creative. And I always like to challenge people. I think with lying within everyone, there's some dormant side of art. It doesn't need to be any sort of level of fanciness, but the impulse to just kind of world build is, I think, the most important thing to approach art with, and that's maybe something I would um, gravitate towards as being the advice on a more grandiose scale. Think of every little thing that you want to make as your own little world where kind of nothing can go wrong. The only thing that is right is whether or not you like it or not. So I've been rolling with that kind of theme lately. I've made a miniature like house model, which is very much like a kind of isolated world, and that's just, I think, the most beautiful sort of thing is just being able to kind of um, like disappear from one that we are existing in, and to kind of allow yourself to shrink down and work on this little creation of your own, yeah, making.
I can't. I just can't right now. My brain's like exploding in 5 million directions. No, seriously. So I was that kid that would build fake houses made out of paper and like dive into this. I mean, yes, of course I had a Barbie house, but that was so
Yeah.
basic. I wanted to make like these like ridiculous like things out of paper, out of Legos, out of cardboard. Like always like tinkering and building worlds. And when I got The Sims way back in the day, guess what I did? I wasn't playing with like the people in the game. I was building things. Like I was always
Yeah.
like tinkering, which is now part of why ceramics is so attractive because I'm building things and they're all pretty.
Yeah.
But anyways, Yeah. Thank you for saying that part
I'm
about
right there with
your
you.
world. I like that. And then I also have another thing I would add to that. When people are like, because we get those too, right? They're like, well, I could never do that. I'm not creative. I'm a computer programmer. And I'm like, so two things. You're up. Sorry, Jackie. Adriana's getting on the climbing on the soapbox right
Yeah.
but hey, this could help you in the store too. Um, Two things. Number one, things like computer programming. That is a language. Art is a
Mhm.
language. You just have to learn it, but it is a language, and we're all capable of learning it. Is whether or not we feel like we want to. That's
Yeah.
different. And then the second thing, troubleshooting is creative. Any way you look at it, and it's like things like we have art. Well, I've heard it from other artists too, including one we interviewed in the past, where they were saying like the number one job of an artist is to make a problem to then try to figure it out. And it's like when you're
Yeah.
building something like you're talking about, that's exactly what you're doing. You're just basically going like, I have a problem, I have all these pieces. How do I how do
Yeah.
ta-da? And then
It's
you're
like one of
making
those charts
other
where you start at the
other
top with your first question, and then like you find one question to ask, and and then you solve that one, and then you keep doing it until you really can't feel like you touch it anymore. One thing that I've been kind of fascinated with lately, which I don't know if you've ever explored. There's one artist I follow, and he was doing an example of generative art, or I guess that's kind of the word for it. It follows like an old like Chinese sort of scripture called the I Ching, where it's essentially taking the artist exclusively out of the equation, and making art that is kind of I guess predetermined with a certain set of criteria. And the one that I saw with this guy is he set up a certain amount of shapes, a certain amount of areas to set those shapes and colors, and he would roll a dice, and it would determine where he placed certain shapes and what orientation. And the creations he came up with were insane. It's very geometric,
Yeah.
and it was like when you're done with it, it's like you kind of had no say in the matter. You're forced to look at this and reconcile its beauty without your input at all. So I think that's really neat. There's a handful of artists I've seen try that, because I think the hardest part is making a system or a program or a language that you can then allow itself to kind of create itself.
Yeah, and I love artists' work like that because I think, especially coming from academia and studying art history, I think it really does open up that conversation of like, do you ever truly have ownership over your ideas? Or from a creative aspect, are these thoughts that come in, the creative muse, so to speak, if you get a little bit more woo-woo with the idea of, do
Yeah,
you actually, is this a pure truth, unique thought? Or is this simply you are the product of these creative influences, and like that's the ultimate, what some people would see as the black and white version of, you don't have any say in it, it's all probability, it's chance, you're rolling these dice. But is that almost a smaller scale version of any decision any of us make? So I think it's really
yeah.
interesting of like, how much of that control do you need in order for you to have ownership over the art? Do you need all of it, or does it not require any of it?
Yeah, it's a very humbling process. I think people are often constantly inspired by nature, which is the like maybe let's say the first art, and
Yeah.
it doesn't nature does not pay attention to its own sort of creativity. It just kind of does. So it's a good thing to kind of follow suit, like to become as closely to the random factors in nature as possible is has interested me for sure. Not that I necessarily have actualized that in my own practice, but
Right.
I think it's a really cool thing to consider, coming from one side of the spectrum, which is like, no, all of the things that I make are like my masterpieces, my own creation, and to completely remove yourself, it's just cool. Two really
Yeah.
cool angles to consider.
Yeah, you're
that's
just
so
another
true.
independent flower that's growing in the forest, and you're just part of this creative world who makes things. You're both influenced by all the flowers and plants around you, and yet also just independently doing your own thing. So
Totally, yeah. We are, at the risk of making a super dad joke, we are just the pot in which the flower grows.
maybe that should be the title of that vase.
There you go.
Part of
Hey,
a
yeah,
big story.
yeah. I'm still working on that one.
Well, if you had $100 right now, what would you splurge it on or invest in? It has to be something that brings you joy and is related to your art or business,
Um, well,
besides
if I
more
had a,
simply.
yeah, yeah, and that was my first thought, but that probably wouldn't even get me a whole lot of stained glass. To be honest, I'd probably end up with something kind of small. Um, well, I might end up with a little extra change left over, but if I had like a small sum of money to spend on something art related, um, it would be I'm gonna get nerdy on you real quick. There's a program on the computer. It's only about $20, and I have an extra 80 to spend, called Sprite. It's a pixel art software, and it's used for making video games, which I'm also a big fan of. And there's also this cool little hardware that just came out, which is about $80. It's basically a little Game Boy exclusively for making pixel art as well. So one of the things that at some point in my life I really want to do, which is very different from what I'm doing now, is design a video game. And so I would invest in that, even though it wouldn't probably like happen for another like 10 years or something. I'm really interested in that process. I play a lot of games, and I like, get to see a lot of these cool art styles. It's a really neat avenue for art. And just there's so much that goes into it. So I kind of want to like dive deep into the technological and like hardware and software side of that, so I can kind of start thinking about it, because it's one of those things that people think about. And they're like, oh, I'm going to make a video game, but there's like also so many things involved. It's kind of crazy. That's like world building on like to the extreme,
Watch out, Minecraft. Jason's coming for you.
Hey, yeah. Exactly.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Jason, for joining us today. It has been so much fun talking to you. And real quick, before we hop off, what upcoming opportunities are you looking forward to, upcoming projects, and how can our listeners stay in contact with you after they listen to this episode?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you all so much for having me. This has been really fun. I love just kind of getting to talk with my other fellow awesome artists and just talk about like art and then life. But of what I'm working on and how people can connect, I mean, I got this exhibition at Golden Belt, which I think is pretty neat, and it's going to be open for the month of August. So that will be happening, and the reception is on the 19th. So we'll be out and about, answering questions for that. And other opportunities, I got a special television that I'm going to be working on soon. So that's been on the back burner for a hot minute, but I'm excited to start with that one. And just kind of those things. And Artimat, once again, I've been talking with the guy who does the Artimat, since I'm kind of like the resident Artimat freak at the museum. And he's like, please send us more Artimats, because it's just like a really cool avenue. So I'd definitely like to participate in that too.
That's so cool. And where can our listeners stay connected with you on social media?
Well, right now, I'm just an Instagram man. I would love to. I'm going to get a website one of these days, but that's definitely a catch-all for people looking to just kind of follow my like process and vision. So stay tuned for some slightly more cemented artistic developments in that way.
Yeah, what's your Instagram name?
Night.owl.creations. I would have just had Night Owl Creations, but there's someone out there who already has that real estate, and they have not answered my messages. So that's me.
We'll link it all. We'll link it all in the notes for this episode.
Awesome. Well, y'all are awesome. Thank you so much. I love your art, and I can't wait to see all the things that y'all come up with, and maybe see you at First Friday.
Yes, for sure. And as always, all of our social media links and notes from today's episode will be linked in today's show notes, where you can find episode notes and links to all of our other podcast episodes, including links to Jason's Instagram and other elements that we referenced in today's episode.
Yeah, and if you want to stay connected with us in between episodes and share what you have learned, you can connect with us on social media. I'm at Amaya Art across all platforms.
And I'm at J Sanders Studio on all platforms. Or you can follow the podcast at Level Up Artist on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.